Good cold evening, gentlemen. I'm Dr. King Schultz.
What kind of doctor?
Dentist?
Today I'm going to show you a 2012 American revisionist Western film called Django Unchained. But before starting, I would like to request all of you to subscribe to our YouTube channel and also hit the bell icon to get notified. Let's begin. The movie begins in Texas, wherein a group of shackled enslaved black people walks on foot in the middle of the Texas desert, while the brothers Ace and Dickie Speck drive them. It was 2 years before the Civil War in 1858, and unfortunately, Django was part of the enslaved black people who separated from his wife, Broomhilda von Shaft, after getting sold off. Then later at night, their voyage suddenly gets interrupted by Dr. King Schultz, a German dentist turned bounty hunter who stumbles around in the dark to approach them. Because of that, Ace is eventually enraged as he asks Schultz to state his business or else he'll get winged. So Schultz immediately responds, trying to calm Ace by saying that he's simply a fellow weary traveler looking for a pair of slave traders that go by the name of the Speck brothers. Technically, Schultz is seeking to buy Django for his knowledge of the 3 outlaw brittle brothers, so he assumes that the Speck brothers have purchased those men at the Greenville auction where Django can be found. Schultz then begins with a question, asking the enslaved black people if there is anyone who is formerly a resident of the Kerrigan plantation, so that way he can buy Django. After Django speaks, Schultz brings his kerosene lamp to light up the faces of the enslaved black people and find Django. Afterward, he asks Django if he has any information about the Brill brothers, so Django states their names, Big John, Ellis, and Roger, who sometimes they call Little Raj. Django then perceives I'm talking about them, saying that they were overseers at the Kerrigan plantation owned by his previous owner, but Schultz stops him, telling Django that they are not the overseers anymore. Afterward, Schultz walks toward Dickie's area, sarcastically apologizing for putting a bullet into his beast. However, Schultz didn't want him to do anything rash before Dickie had his moment to come to his senses. Despite seeing how frustrated Dickie is, Schultz still maintains himself to be calm and favors him to keep his caterwauling down to a minimum because he still wants to finish his line of inquiry with Django. Schultz then goes back to Django's position to continue their conversation, insisting Dickie pay a fair price after hearing that Django can still recognize the Brittle brothers. Unfortunately, Schultz leaves the other enslaved black people to let them kill Dickie themselves, while Django takes Ace's coat and horse. The following day, Django and Schultz arrive at Daughtry, Texas, unconsciously getting the attention of the house owners because Django is the first black man they see riding a horse. Fortunately, they suddenly own the bar restaurant as the innkeeper runs away after seeing Django. Entering with Schultz, unfortunately, Schultz feels guilty, so he agrees with Django, which Django will kill the Brittle brothers and receives his freedom with $75 as payment. Later, Schultz and Django begin their voyage when suddenly Schultz finds out that Django is a married man after hearing his answers that he will find his wife and buy her freedom afterward. Django reveals that Broomhilda was raised by a German and later learns to speak German a little. Broomhilda served to be a house slave of the von Schafts. After their conversation, they proceed to the Tennessee place and find themselves a shelter as they plan to access the plantation, which Django will play as a valet character to put up an act. Schultz then gives Django the freedom to choose whatever costume he wants. Afterward, they go to the plantation to visit Spencer Big Daddy Bennett and purchase one of his enslavers. Fortunately, Big Daddy agrees, so Schultz takes it as an opportunity to order his slave to tour Django. On his magnificent plantation, suddenly, while Bettina is touring around Django at the plantation, Django asks her if he knows about the Brill brothers. Yet Bettina answers no, so Django that there's a possibility that they are using a different name. Afterward, he shoots Little Raj 5 times when Schultz eventually arrives at the stable to ask Django the name of the 2 Brittles he killed. Then Django says that Ellis is hightailing across the field right now, allowing Schultz to snipe him without hesitation. Later at night, Big Daddy attempts to attack Django and Schultz with a posse despite letting them leave after killing the Brittle brothers due to the warrant earlier in the afternoon. Unfortunately, they failed to convince Big Daddy that the penalty for taking deadly force against an officer of the court in the performance of his duty will be hung by the neck until they're dead. Leaving him no choice, Schultz ambushes the posse with explosives by tricking them using his cart. Fortunately, Schultz gets bullseye after hitting the carriage and then gives the sniper to Django to snipe Big Daddy. Afterward, Django and Schultz spend their night eating as Django eventually talks about his wife. So Schultz happily tells the story of Broomhilda he knows and entertains Django. Later, they travel to Mississippi only to see many enslaved black people on the street. Afterward, they eventually learn that Broomhilda's new owner is Calvin J. Candy, who owns the 4th biggest cotton plantation in Mississippi, Candyland. Desperate, Schultz asks how they will get her from Calvin, so Schultz offers an alternative action plan. Instead of buying a horse, they will plan to buy a farm. Schultz then suggests that Django will be an expert on Mandingo fighting he hired because his character will be a big money buyer from Dusseldorf and Greenville and buy his way into the Mandingo fight game. Technically, Calvin is a kind of owner that that forced his slaves to wrestle to the death in brutal Mandingo fights. After a while, Django and Schultz meet Calvin at his gentleman's club, finishing watching the Mandingo fights while Django refuses to see it. Afterward, Schultz follows Calvin as he talks to his champion, Fred, attempting to offer $12,000 for one of his best fighters as a pretext for acquiring Broomhilda for a nominal sum since Calvin doesn't want to sell her. Luckily, they get the attention of Calvin and even receive an invitation to Candyland. After that, Calvin stops and approaches Django, asking if he won't mind handling D'Artagnan, and that is ordering the tracker dogs to maul D'Artagnan to death. Upset, Schultz has left no choice but to watch over D'Artagnan getting eaten by the dogs. Afterward, they continue their arrival on Candyland as if nothing happened in the woods. Suddenly, Stephen gets shocked after seeing Django riding a horse with Schultz, so Calvin clarifies that Django is a freeman and orders him to treat them well. Afterwards, Schultz favors Calvin to clean up Hildy, Broomhilda's name, because he wants to meet her. Unfortunately, Django hears about their mistreatment of Broomhilda, so he almost takes out his gun when he realizes that he needs to calm herself to buy his wife. To his dismay, Django watches the crying Broomhilda taking her out to the litter box to clean up. Then later at night, Lara Lee delivers Broomhilda to Schultz's room to talk. Afterward, he reminds Broomhilda that he will only speak German, assuming that Calvin's slavers listen to them because he will finally reveal their plan to rescue her. Then he proceeds on securing his offer to buy her as his escort while he negotiates the initial deal during dinner. Confused, Broomhilda asks about his friend's identity, so Django eventually shows himself to her. Later at dinner night, Schultz begins entertaining Calvin to accept his deal when suddenly Stephen, the staunchly loyal and suspicious head house slave of Calvin, realizes that Broomhilda knows Django after. Seeing her get shocked by Lara Lee's comments towards him. Unfortunately, Calvin alters the deal at gunpoint to sell Broomhilda for $12,000 instead of the fighter, Eskimo Joe. Schultz reluctantly agrees, but when Calvin aggressively threatens them to beat Broomhilda using a hammer, if ever, Schultz refuses to take the deal. Leaving him no choice, Schultz gives him the money immediately. Afterward, they finish their deal as they wait for Calvin to provide him with Broomhilda's paper. However, Schultz suddenly had enough of Calvin's arrogance after hearing him say to shake hands with him, or else he will continue killing Broomhilda, shooting Calvin until he dies. So Butch Pooch immediately responds, killing Schultz using his rifle as Django eventually goes on a rampage, shooting back Pooch, Calvin's lawyer, and several of Calvin's henchmen. Fortunately, Lara Lee changes her mind about sipping Django as she will give him to delinquent Dicky people instead. Technically, Lara Lee has left no choice but to replace his brother and take charge of the plantation. She also chooses to let Django suffer to death by selling him to the said mining company. Minutes later, Django is en route to the company of his new owner when suddenly he devises an escape plan by attempting to talk with his escort, handling his first handbill to prove that he's a bounty hunter. Desperate, Django feeds them lies by giving false claims that the men on his handbill are at Candyland, then promises his escorts that he will share the reward money with them. Luckily, Django gets released by his escorts after they believe in him with the help of his co-enslaved men. The movie ends with Django then bidding goodbye to Schultz by tapping his head, planning to avenge him and D'Artagnan, who died from the mauls of Calvin's slave dogs. Afterward, Django directly goes to the shelter, where Broomhilda is getting jailed. Fortunately, Django takes it as an opportunity to save Broomhilda while Calvin's his burial to give respect. Then later at night, Django kills Lara, Crash, and the remaining henchmen who just got back from the mansion after mourning Calvin's death. Afterward, Django orders the two remaining enslaved women to bid their goodbyes to Lara Lee, while Stephen, on the other hand, stops him from getting outside. Upon earning his revenge, Django kneecaps Stephen as he ignites the dynamite that he already planted all around the mansions, ignoring Stephen's cries inside. Afterward, Django and Broomhilda watch from a distance the exploding manor and ride off the horse together. Because of that, people will be calling Django the fastest gun in the South from now on. Thanks for watching.